Mr. Chairman. Make sure that we understand, I don't think there's a person on this panel here in Congress that wants to see the mercury levels increase or cause problems. I think what we're trying to do is what's the best way to reduce our exposure. And from what I can understand, using some of the information from the EPA, primarily we're getting our exposure to mercury by eating fish and shellfish. Water is not necessarily a source of that because we can capture that and through the testing in our municipal water systems, we'll test for that. So I'm interested if it's the fish, if it's the ingestion of fish that we're getting. I did some study on this. We saw on the Atlantic coast, the Atlantic tuna, the content or the exposure there to mercury is dropped precipitously, but yet on the West Coast, the mercury levels in the Pacific fish are increasing dramatically. So we see something that's kind of interesting. Maybe it's relative to the fact that we've reduced by 86% the amount of mercury that we're emitting from our coal-fired power plants, because we understand the wooden patterns, how that works. And I think from your, Dr. Salih, some of your testimony talked about it. Once it gets in the atmosphere, it can stay for thousands of miles, and it may be coming. We have coming from the Pacific Rim. We have a chart that unfortunately I can't blow it up anymore, but it simply shows that the big culprits in providing the mercury emissions into the atmosphere and primarily emitting into the water are coming from China and India, and we have a marked decrease. As a matter of fact, in one of the other reports we have here that was in 2016, says from the EPA that 83% of the mercury that's contaminating in the United States is coming from foreign sources. 83%. So if we're really focusing here, not politics as we see some people chatting here, if we're really talking about how we're going to reduce our mercury levels in this country, I think we need to take into a global perspective of what we're going to do about this. Because these other nations are continuing to emit mercury levels at very high levels. But I want to go back, so I want to go back to this cost-benefit ratio. So if that premise is correct, and I'm not going to get caught up in whether or not whether it's appropriate and necessary and whether co-benefits, I think one of the things we should do, and maybe Gustafson, for you to respond, would be, should in cost benefits, assuming even with the co-benefits, should we be considering the costs that would be incurred in foreign nations to reduce their mercury emissions? And right now, it's my understanding, the costs are only to American power plants that would be imposed, but the benefits will be derived by all. So since 83% is coming from someplace else, are we taking into consideration the costs that would be incurred in foreign nations to reduce, so that we have that a true cost-benefit ratio? Mr. Gustafson?
You're exactly right that much of the mercury deposited in the United States comes from other countries, including China. Then there's nothing that the Environmental Protection Agency can do to control pollution from China that limits the effectiveness of any mercury control within the United States. I would point out, though, that the premise of much of my fellow panelists' comments is that this mercury standard would go away if EPA were to finalize this proposed reconsideration of the fact-finding. That's not true. Under binding precedent in the D.C. Circuit, a case called New Jersey v. EPA, EPA would have to go through a delisting process in order to withdraw these sources from the mercury control. That's not likely to happen. So I don't think the risks that have been talked about here today are really relevant.
So just in closing, guys, just a second. Do you think that we should include the costs incurred by other nations would it be fair to include in the cost-benefit ratio, or should it just be the costs here in America, but the benefits from all sources, including PMs?
That's a complicated question, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to give you an adequate response to it right now. I could follow up in written comments, but I think the EPA's primary responsibility is to address the nation's air quality. That's what the Clean Air Act gives it jurisdiction for, and it's limited in its ability to do that